Today we go behind the scenes of an amazing public garden that's devoted to preserving the history of gardening, as well as keeping an eye out on some new and exciting plants. You won't want to miss it, so stay tuned as we garden smart from Georgia.
The Safer brand organic lawn care program makes house calls. By ordering online, the lawn you want can be delivered right to your door. The Safer brand organic lawn care program is a proud sponsor of public television and GardenSMART.
I should be arrested for crimes against potted plant kind. My house is where plants came to die.
Miracle-Gro potting mix is designed to help grow big, beautiful plants. Everyone grows with Miracle-Gro.
Hey there, little red blackbird. You sure are looking good.
In 1926, the Atlanta Historical Society was formed to help preserve the city's history. Over the past 82 years, the organization grew substantially, and in 1990, it became the Atlanta History Center. Now located on 33 acres in historic Buckhead, the center is home to numerous museums and 6 beautiful historic gardens that represent Georgia's distinctive flora, both native and introduced. Each garden tells the story of a particular group of people who interacted with this land and its plants in distinguishable ways. The gardens are often the overlooked gem on the campus of the History Center, and today we'll explore the history of this great city through the lens of 6 unique gardens. Sarah Roberts is a curator of the historic gardens and has a long and decorated career in public and private gardening. Today she'll be taking us back in time to discuss heirloom plants and the design principles that have been preserved for generations to come. Sarah, thanks so much for being with us today.
Well, Eric, we're really happy to have you here.
You've got quite a bit of experience with public gardens, don't you?
I've been really lucky. I've gotten to work at Blooms of Bressingham in England, at the Arnold Arboretum of Harvard University, and of course I had 5 years at the New York Botanical Garden as their curator of herbaceous plants and outdoor gardens, and I got to work with some incredibly talented people there.
Wow. So what brought you to Atlanta?
I'm actually from Atlanta. I grew up here. I learned about horticulture from my dad, from just following him around in the garden, learning about ornamental plants. My mom's a great vegetable gardener, so I learned from her. And when it came time to go off to college, I didn't go real far away. It felt very natural to go get my bachelor's at Berry College in horticulture. And I spent a year abroad in England, as well as part of that time studying horticulture abroad.
Wonderful. Now, this is my first visit to the Atlanta Historical Society.
Okay.
What can you tell me about the gardens here?
Well, actually the gardens are the part of the History Center most people don't know about. We have 22 acres of green space in Atlanta. There are 6 historic gardens, 2 historic houses, and miles of trails.
Wow. Can't wait to see it.
Let's go have a look.
Sarah, this is such a wonderful garden, and one thing that I love about this space is you have a significant change in elevation, and people who are coming to view the garden can basically walk around the perimeter of it and look down inside, and there's just a tremendous view that you get.
That's true. You get a really good shot of the pond here and the bridge. Actually, that change in elevation that you mentioned, that's because this is an abandoned rock quarry.
Wow.
It's actually a historic site in and of itself, and some inspired members from the Memphis Garden Club came here, saw this filled with invasive plants and some native plants, and decided that this would be a great home for a native plant garden for Georgia. So we have over 600 species in here of Georgia's native plants.
Let's talk about some of the trees and shrubs that you're growing.
Okay, well, one of the trees we're most known for in the quarry garden is our state champion Franklinia alatamaha. Some people call that the lost camellia, and ours is very tall and usually tall for that species. And what's so great about it is that it's a plant that's extinct in the wild. It was discovered here in Georgia on the banks of the Altamaha River by John and William Bartram. was last seen in the wild in 1803. So because they collected seed and plant material on their explorations and brought it back to their home, all the descendants we have of that species now are from those original collections.
You also have some wonderful blooming plants, the calmeas, which actually are very difficult, can be a difficult plant for many gardeners to grow, right?
They can, and we're very fortunate here to have this microclimate, this incredibly quick drainage, and because we're on these slopes, we get all the rainwater, so they get plenty of water rushing down the side of the rock face here where they can grow and thrive.
One of my favorite natives is Aesculus pavian, and that's one that we don't see very often. It's the red flowering buckeye. That's a beautiful plant, and then also the Chionanthus virginicus, which is one that we don't oftentimes see in gardens, but I think one of the most impactful flowering native plants.
And what a shame that we don't see it more. It's actually my favorite understory tree. I think it's incredibly graceful. It has very delicate flowers that are fragrant. They're flowering now, and we have a very big specimen of the fringe tree, the Chionanthus. Here, it's about 20 feet tall, which is pretty large.
Now let's talk about perennials, and there's a ton of perennials in flower right now. What are some of your favorites?
Wow, that's such a hard thing to say. To ask if horticulture is your favorite perennial. It's like asking what my favorite child is or something. Perennials, well, actually in the really wet, boggy part of the quarry garden, we have some beautiful perennials flowering. One of my favorite is Iris virginica. It's our blue flag, our southern iris. It's a great substitute for the more invasive yellow fleur-de-lis iris or the Iris pseudacris. Right. Grows in colonies, and actually its roots can grow right underwater. So if you have really wet spot or moist soil that's consistently moist or seasonally floods, that's a great plant. Also great is our native Zephyranthes adamasco, the rain lily. So it can also grow in boggy soil or seasonal flooding, and it looks great with golden alexanders. They flower at the same time, and it can just move its way up through the foliage of the golden alexanders, Zizia aurea, and flower. And it's bright and it's white and it looks great in the shade.
Yeah, it's a wonderful perennial. One thing that I think is really particularly nice about public gardens, and especially when they're done well, it's a great place to come learn, what plants look good together. And then in the case of your wetland garden, it's a wonderful place for people to learn, if they have a boggy area in their yard, you can come look at this collection of plants and pick up some great ideas on how to handle those kind of tough situations.
Exactly, and there are trees in there as well, the Don cypress, Don redwood, Taxodium disticum, which is great. It grows those knees in swampy soil. There's also Agarista, which is a great low maintenance evergreen shrub. There's Tiarella, the foam flower. It has a real frothy white flower. It's a ground cover. It spreads by rhizomes. It has very handsome foliage. That's another favorite perennial of mine to use. We planted it all throughout the quarry garden.
This is a very interesting departure from the quarry garden, and it looks like it's a replica of an old working farm.
Well, actually, this is a real working farm. This is the Smith family farm. The house was built in 1845. This farm was 800 acres, but now we've compressed it here on the site to a couple of acres. And we interpret the period in the Civil War era in the 1860s.
This garden definitely captures the look and feel of an early American perennial border, and of course it's complete with its own swept lawn.
It is. The swept yard is very traditional for the Old South. It kept rodents, insects, and things away from the house, and of course it's a lot lower maintenance.
And were the perennials that were used in these gardens, were they mostly for cut gardens, and what kind of plants would have been planted?
They could have had cut flowers, and actually we use the Southern Cultivator, which is an heirloom periodical that we actually have at the Cherokee Garden Library on site. And that is a periodical that they might have read. The Smith family might have actually read those same things, so we can glean some insight on what plants they grew, what cultivars, and their methods and techniques. So in the flower yard in the front of the house, this is where the lady might have had some things that she thought were ornamental and pretty and would have planted around the borders. Roses, perennials, and reseeding annuals and biennials.
What are some of the perennial plants that would have been used in a garden from this time period?
Well, bearded iris, peonies, these are both really tough plants. Daylilies, like the old species daylilies, the tawny ones. There's Silene floscuculi, which is ragged robin, and that's what that frothy pink flower is all around this garden. And that seeds in everywhere. And we just move it around a little bit, and then it will fill in the gaps between all the perennials and shrubs. These are sturdy plants that have stood the test of time. The Byzantine gladiolus, that's that hot magenta color, It's very easy. It just doesn't want to be overly wet. That's really about it. Give it some sun and some good drainage. The heliotrope, which smells wonderful, and actually back in the day here they would have called it cherry pie. That was its common name, but it smells a little bit like vanilla to me. And that's a deep, rich purple, and we can grow that from seed. We actually grow a lot of things from seed here because it's not the same plant material you'll find in the big box stores. This is something you have to get yourself and start on your own.
150 years ago, the vegetable garden would have been a very important garden for, of course, any working farm, but for most homesteads as well. And you've done a great job of collecting a number of heirloom vegetables and also displaying them in the way that they would have been grown back in the 1800s.
Right, we do think that it was incredibly important to grow your own vegetables all the way back then and of course today. The heirloom vegetables that we've just recently harvested are our cool season crops. We've gone past our last frost date now and we're ready to start putting in our summer vegetables. So we finished up with these. These were white icicle radishes. It's a very early variety and it's pretty hot. If you pick them when they're smaller, they're a little bit milder. And we had long-standing Bloomsdale spinach, which is actually the same variety that my mom grows at home today. You can pick it up in big box stores or heirloom seed catalogs. We have to special order most of our seed and grow it ourselves, but that's one that's really stood the test of time and is still very popular.
Now, what are some of the summer vegetables that you grow?
Well, we grow a lot. We have to grow tomatoes because we can them. These are people that needed to can and preserve their harvest, whether it was in a root cellar or by canning or drying. So tomatoes, we also do squashes, eggplants, cayenne peppers, bell peppers, garlic, leeks, parsnips, salsify. There's all kinds of old-timey vegetables that we can use in modern varieties. They don't have a home here, but we still grow tomatoes, we still grow squashes, we just grow different varieties.
So are the beds that you've planted the vegetables in are essentially a makeshift raised bed, that's not that dissimilar to the kind of raised beds that we would build in our gardens today, right?
Right, absolutely. This you could consider the precursor to the modern day raised bed. And all this is some Georgia farmers realizing how tough this soil was to work. They'd plow it up and they'd hill it up like this in ridges in order to get better drainage for their vegetables. Our crops in the vegetable gardens are done this way and also out in the fields.
Many vegetables that we would use in the garden can be grown from seed. Of course, lettuces are easy to do from seed, and well, nearly any vegetable. Some I find are easier just to buy the plants already, and for me, tomatoes is one of those. And we would plant tomatoes a little differently than other vegetables, wouldn't we?
That's true, and most people do just buy their tomatoes already potted up. We actually do grow ours from seed. We have a greenhouse, we have heat mats. We can start them before last frost, about 8 weeks before. And when we plant them, because we use these biodegradable cow pots, which I think are far superior to peat pots, which don't seem to break down in the soil that well. When we plant these, you plant the entire pot and about 4 inches of the stem of the tomato. So I can actually go ahead and just plant this one here. Now I'm gonna dig a little bit behind where I want this plant to go. Set it out of the way. Doesn't need to be really deep because what we're gonna do is pick these lower leaves off of the tomato. And of course, it's never too early to scout for pests. So I see I have an aphid here. I'm just gonna squish him real quick.
Sure.
So I've picked off all those lower leaves and I'm gonna set the tomato in the ground on its side. This is a technique my mom taught me and she has Georgia's most productive tomato garden. So it works, I'm not gonna change it. So you're setting it in deep on its side and then holding the tip upward. Then you just backfill this hole. All of our soil we amend with horse manure and compost. So it's very rich. Tomatoes are heavy feeders, of course. Tamp that down. Make sure you've got contact with the roots and the stem. It's very simple, that's all you do. Now, one important thing to remember is which way you put your pot or that root ball if you're just sliding it out of a plastic pot. I always put that facing forward so I can put my stake at the back. If you don't remember and you do them all different directions, you might end up spearing that root ball. So what we'll use are some 8-foot tall stakes. Drive them in the ground at least a foot, and we're gonna grow these in a cordon style. This is an 1800s method of saving space in your garden. We actually only allow 2 main vines of the tomato to grow. We tie it up with cotton strips, which is what they would have had available to tie up their tomatoes. They didn't have wire cages, so this is what we do. But I love it. We get a lot more tomatoes per square foot growing them in this method. So we'll tie them up and we'll just pinch out a lot of that extra growth. Otherwise you get a lot of vine production and not as many tomatoes.
It's a great space-saving way to grow tomatoes, and also I think it's also an attractive way to trellis tomatoes.
It is, and people love to see it. There are other methods that you can use, but this is the best one for a small garden.
Something I really love about walking through this garden are all the incredible borrowed views. So anything from a quarry, a very unusual structure, if you will, a colonial home, and then this grand mansion.
That's true. We have some incredible vistas here, and I think this one at the Swan House is probably one of the best in Atlanta. You have a great shot from Andrews Drive looking all the way up these sweeping terraces to the Swan House itself. It was designed by Philip Trammell-Schutze, who also was the landscape architect, and he was a genius at directing the eye. He uses evergreen shrubbery, Elaeagnus, to fence in this property from the woodland beyond and sculpt this view up to the house itself, as well as this fountain, which was actually based on the Villa Corsini in Rome. That also draws your eye right up to the door at the top.
Right, they definitely wanted the house to be the star of the show. There's not, as you mentioned, there's not a lot of color. It's mostly different shades of green, and that basically just provides a nice picture frame for this amazing vista.
It does. The greenery is the backdrop in this case, rather than having a lot of ornamental flowering plants. We do have some roses here in this garden that are beautiful when they flower in the summer, but really it is about the structure of the garden, the peaceful, tranquil nature here, and the house, the land, and the architecture.
What are some of the plants that they would have used?
Well, Schutze was challenged by his clients to make this garden look instantly old, which is something that we still struggle with today. We want our gardens to be instantly big and beautiful. So in the 1920s, they had Elaeagnus, which is what he used for the evergreen hedges, and running bamboo, which served as a screen in certain parts. And of course, it grows really fast. Now, the price you pay for getting that instant gratification is, in the long run, it's actually a lot more maintenance. You get that rampant growth and an invasive nature.
Yeah, and I think that's great advice for gardeners, is think about what the garden's going to be in 5 years, in 10 years. You know, a 2-year-old garden does not need to look like a 10-year-old garden.
Right.
And, you know, that goes down to how we space plants, not planting them too close together. And like you said, you know, looking at things like boxwood that have more controlled growth, but in the long run are going to be a lot lower maintenance.
Right. And actually, boxwood is a plant that Schutze did use here in the landscape. We have some very large specimens here that have aged very gracefully with the home, which is what you want in your home landscape. And because they're slower growing, they're a whole lot less maintenance. We use the cultivar of Korean boxwood called Justin Brower's in the boxwood garden around the side of the Swan House. It's a great little intimate space, and that boxwood is slow growing. It responds very well to pruning. It's sun tolerant, but it does get some shade here, which it needs in the south. As long as it doesn't have wet roots in winter or a hard winter wind, it's gonna be fine. Very low maintenance.
The last stop on our garden tour is a classic example of a high shade garden, which is, you know, typical in many parts of the country, but especially so here in the Southeast.
That's true. We do have a lot of gentle topography, rolling hills, and a lot of pine trees, oak trees, a lot of root competition.
Sure, this can be a challenging area to grow in. I know in my own garden, I've got a high shade area, and just finding plants that work well is tough sometimes. And this is a wonderful opportunity for gardeners or people just, you know, looking at a high shade area. Come by, figure out what plants not only work in that environment, but also which plants work well together.
Right, and actually behind us are some of my favorite plants in this garden. We have Japanese maples, and I love that burgundy foliage type. Oak leaf hydrangeas, which are native as well, and they do great here. They tolerate our drought and our clay soil. We've got Chamaecyparis behind us, that real feathery, filigree foliage. Rhododendrons and azaleas we have a lot of in this garden. That's really the spine, a backbone of structure in this garden.
So with this garden, you're not as bound to the historical authenticity of the plants, right? This is one that you get to play around a little more in?
Right, we don't have a period that we are glued to for this garden, so I enjoy playing in all of our gardens here with different plants, but here I'm actually a little bit freer. There's not a restricted plant palette. It's not a certain period. I can really play around with things and create mixed borders in a naturalistic setting.
One plant I do want to draw attention to that we don't see in many gardens, in fact, I would say it's a new emerging plant, is Distilleum. And you've got some planted on a slope right behind us, and it's a tough plant, wonderful foliage, and it's really neat to see it in the garden.
I am glad you mentioned that plant. It's my favorite new plant on the market. The one that we have here is Distilleum Blue Cascade. It's a hybrid, and it has a great glaucous blue-green sheen over the top of some really dark green leaves. It has a natural cascading habit, so I actually planted it on a slope. This is a slope where nobody wants to have to climb up and plant or prune or do anything that's going to be high maintenance. Sure. So we picked this evergreen, naturally cascading form, and we've worked it down the slope, so it will cover all of that ground throughout the year and be very low maintenance for us.
Yeah, it's not an easy plant to find, but it's definitely well worth trying to seek it out.
Well worth hunting it out.
Now let me ask you this, Sarah, of the toughest of the tough dry shade plants,
right,
what would be your top picks?
Well, number one, I'm going to have to go with epimediums, or fairy wings, some people call them. They look so delicate, but they are so tough.
They are.
The new growth emerges with some bronzy oranges and burgundy tones. The foliage is handsome and it lasts all year. It's only about 6 or 8 inches tall, most of the varieties you see in the trade. And then the flowers come up in winter, so you get that great winter interest. There's yellow or pink or white varieties that you can find. They're very dainty and they just dangle above the leaves. And you can cut off that old winter foliage and really showcase the new growth that's coming up under those flowers. That's my top one. For a shrub or something a little bit bigger with some meat to it, I would use Fatsia japonica. It's got a great glossy dark green leaf, and I've actually grown it right under magnolias and tough spots where nobody wants to be, and it does just fine.
Yeah, those are great picks. One of the mistakes that I made as a beginning gardener was pruning my azaleas at the wrong time of the year and also not pruning them correctly.
Okay.
What advice would you have for gardeners, specifically when it comes to pruning azaleas?
Pruning azaleas, that is one of those things that we see done badly around here because we have a lot of azaleas in the South. What you want to not do is use your hedge trimmers. Don't make them square, don't make them gumdrop shaped, don't give them bad haircuts. If you shear an azalea, you're gonna get all the growth of leaves and flowers just on those outer couple of inches. Instead, there's 2 other types of pruning cuts you can do. If you've already decimated your azalea, the first type of pruning cut you would do is to rejuvenate it. That's called a heading cut, and that's when you're taking a branch all the way back and pruning it off, not to where there's another branch union, but just basically a stub cut. That's going to produce a lot of new growth right below your cut. And you can come back in there and thin that out a little bit, pinch them to make them more dense, and you'll create a new canopy for your azalea. You could also do that, reach in and take 1 or 2 branches out like that to make a more dense shrub. But typically what you really need to do, and probably the only thing most people need to do, is thinning. And for thinning, just grab my pruners here. All you're gonna do is take a branch that you think has grown a little bit outside of the canopy, further away. It's getting a little bit too big and you just wanna make this a little smaller. So you can take a branch like this and prune it back to a union with another branch. It's a small cut. You reach in and you're just feathering these cuts through. More sunlight's gonna get into your azaleas. It's gonna stimulate more growth. And you're not gonna have any ugly pruning cuts that are gonna be an eyesore. One thing I do wanna mention about azaleas is that because they come in such a riot of colors, pinks, lavenders, oranges, it's very easy to make a raucous mix of azaleas. You can make it easier on yourself and just buy 1 cultivar and mass those or drop them in your landscape. Or go out and buy them when they're in bloom, when they're fully flowering, so you can see if you're making a combination that's not going to be that pleasing.
That's great advice. Well, Sarah, thank you so much for spending the day with us. The gardens look amazing, and we've really learned a tremendous amount from you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you guys for coming out here. It was a pleasure to have you.
Another show, another amazing garden. We hope you've enjoyed this episode as much as we've enjoyed producing it. If you watch the show, you know we travel the country visiting beautiful gardens. Well, we have a surprise in store for several in the audience. To learn more about the surprise, visit our website at GardenSMART.com.
The Safer brand organic lawn care program makes house calls. By ordering online, the lawn you want can be delivered right to your door. The Safer brand organic lawn care program is a proud sponsor of public television and GardenSMART.
I should be arrested for crimes against potted plant kind. My house is where plants came to die.
Miracle Grow potting mix is designed to help grow big, beautiful plants. Everyone grows with Miracle Grow.
Hey there, little red blackbird. You sure are looking good.
It's so much fun to step back in time and learn how the gardens of our ancestors were grown and maintained, as well as picking up some great tips on how we can take these classic design techniques and apply them to our home gardens. If you have questions about anything you've seen today, visit us on the web at GardenSMART.com. And remember, even if you're a master gardener, there's always more to learn. So join us next week for more great gardening tips and ideas as we garden smart.